Henry Carter, a successful but emotionally distant businessman, is haunted by the loss of his daughter, Lily. But when a chance encounter with a mysterious young man at her grave unravels a hidden truth, Henry's world is turned upside down. The young man, Daniel, is not a stranger, he's his grandson, a connection Henry never knew existed. What follows is an emotional journey of redemption, as Henry tries to repair the fractured bonds of the past while building a relationship with the grandson who grew up believing he was forgotten. Together, they embark on a shared project restoring an old Mustang that becomes more than just a car. It's a bridge between their worlds. But will their fragile bond withstand the weight of old wounds and unspoken regrets? Or will the ghosts of Henry's past prove too much to overcome? The air in the cemetery was sharp and cold, carrying the unmistakable scent of decaying leaves. The towering oaks that lined the gravel path shivered in the late autumn breeze, their bare branches scratching the sky like skeletal fingers. Henry Carter adjusted the collar of his wool coat, his breath forming pale clouds in the chill. He walked slowly, the weight of his years pressing down on him, not just in his steps but in his heart. His hands, hidden in leather gloves, clutched a bouquet of Lily's favorite. It had been 2 years since his daughter's life was stolen in a tragic car accident. 2 years since Henry's once mighty world began crumbling. He visited her grave every Sunday without fail, always at the same early hour when the world felt still. These visits had become his only solace, a ritual that offered him a fleeting sense of closeness to the daughter he had loved fiercely, though imperfectly. The cemetery was empty as he entered the familiar section where Lily rested. He liked it that way. The solitude allowed him to remember without interruption, to replay moments he had once taken for granted. It wasn't just grief that gnawed at him, but regret, the sharp-edged realization that their last words to each other had been an argument over her refusal to join the family business. She had wanted her independence. He had wanted her to stay close. Now her silence was permanent, and he was left to wrestle with the emptiness. As he rounded the last corner, Henry froze. A figure was kneeling by Lily's grave. It was a young man, no older than 20, wearing a jacket far too thin for the biting weather. His dark hair fell messily over his forehead as he bowed his head, hands clasped tightly together in what looked like prayer. The sight was so unexpected, so out of place, that Henry felt a flicker of irritation. This was his time with Lily. Who was this boy, and why was he here? Clearing his throat, Henry made his presence known. The young man flinched, startled, and looked up. His pale blue eyes, rimmed red from the cold, or perhaps from tears, met Henry's. For a moment, the boy didn't move, frozen like a deer caught in headlights. "Who are you?" Henry demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. "What are you doing here?" The boy scrambled to his feet, brushing dirt from his knees. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to intrude. I was just," he trailed off, taking a step back as if Henry's presence was too much to bear. "This is private," Henry said firmly, though his own curiosity was beginning to eclipse his irritation. "Do you even know whose grave this is?" "Yes, sir," the boy replied, his voice trembling. His gaze flickered down to the gravestone and then back up to Henry. "It's Lily Carter's." Hearing her name from the stranger's lips felt like a blow to Henry's chest. "How do you know her?" he asked, his tone softening despite himself. The boy hesitated, his expression a mixture of fear and sadness. "I knew her," he said simply. Before Henry could press further, the young man turned and hurried away, his thin frame disappearing down the gravel path. Henry stood there, stunned and alone once again, his questions multiplying like a swarm of gnats. The encounter haunted Henry for the rest of the day. Who was that boy? And how did he know Lily? His mind churned through possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. By the time he returned to his sprawling estate, he was consumed by an unshakable need for answers. The house was silent, as it always was now. Its grand halls, once filled with laughter and conversation, felt cavernous and cold. Every room was a reminder of what he had lost. The walls bore photographs of happier times: Lily as a child on her first bicycle, Lily at her high school graduation, Lily beaming on the day she moved into her own apartment. But these frozen moments only deepened the ache in Henry's chest. He poured himself a glass of scotch and sank into his leather armchair in the study, staring into the flames that danced in the fireplace. For years, Henry had prided himself on being a man of control, someone who could bend the world to his will with the sheer force of his wealth and influence. But all the money in the world couldn't bring Lily back, couldn't mend the fractures in their relationship, couldn't explain the presence of that boy at her grave. The boy's face lingered in his mind, his wide blue eyes filled with something Henry couldn't quite place. Was it guilt? Grief? Both? There was something familiar about him, though Henry couldn't pinpoint what it was. He drained the scotch and set the glass down with a decisive clink. He would get to the bottom of this. The next morning, Henry made a call to a private investigator he had worked with in the past. The man, Jack Harmon, was discreet in thorough qualities Henry valued highly. "I need you to look into someone," Henry said, pacing his study as he spoke on the phone. "A young man, early 20s, dark hair, blue eyes. I saw him at my daughter's grave yesterday." "Do you have a name?" Jack asked. "No," Henry admitted, "but I have a feeling he's connected to her somehow. Find out who he is and what he wants." Jack agreed, and the call ended. Henry stood by the window, staring out at the manicured gardens that stretched beyond the estate. He felt a strange mixture of dread and anticipation. The boy's sudden appearance had cracked open a door Henry thought had long been closed, and now there was no turning back. 3 days later, Jack called with an update. "I found him," Jack said. "His name is Daniel Reed. He's 20 years old, lives in a small apartment on the other side of town. Works odd jobs to make ends meet. But here's the kicker: his mother is Emma Reed." The name hit Henry like a lightning bolt. Emma Reed. He remembered her vividly, a shy young woman Lily had befriended during college, a girl from a modest background who had always seemed out of place in their affluent world. What does Emma have to do with this? Henry asked, though he already suspected the answer. "She's Daniel's mother," Jack said. "And according to my research, Daniel is Lily's son." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Henry felt the ground shift beneath him, his carefully constructed world tilting on its axis. He sank into his chair, his mind racing to process the revelation. A grandson. He had a grandson, and he had never known. That night, Henry couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts tangled in a web of disbelief, guilt, and something he hadn't felt in years: hope. For so long, he had believed his chance to make things right with Lily had died with her. But now, with Daniel, there was a glimmer of possibility, a chance to heal, to build something meaningful from the wreckage. He didn't know how Daniel would react to him, or if the boy would even want a relationship. But one thing was clear: Henry couldn't ignore this. As dawn broke, casting a pale, golden light over the estate, Henry decided he would find a way to meet Daniel. He would face whatever anger or rejection came his way. Because for the first time in years, Henry felt the stirrings of purpose, a reason to keep going. And it was enough. Henry Carter had always considered his home a symbol of his success. Nestled on sprawling acres, the Carter estate stood as a monument to decades of tireless work, an empire built brick by brick. The marble floors gleamed under the morning sun streaming through cathedral-like windows, but to Henry, it had become a mausoleum. He roamed the halls that morning, his thoughts heavy with the revelation Jack Harmon had delivered the night before. Daniel Reed, the boy he had seen at Lily's grave, was his grandson. Henry replayed the conversation in his mind, the words ringing with both shock and regret. Why hadn't Lily told him? Why had Emma kept Daniel's existence a secret? The questions swirled as he passed rooms that once pulsed with life. The dining room, where family dinners had been a battleground of clashing expectations. The sitting room, where Lily had once curled up with a book, evading his persistent talk of her future. His footsteps slowed as he approached the door to Lily's bedroom. It had been 2 years since he last opened it. The thought of stepping inside had always felt unbearable, a doorway to a life frozen in time. But today, driven by the need to understand, he turned the handle and stepped in. The room smelled faintly of lavender, Lily's favorite scent, preserved by the sachets tucked into her dresser drawers. Everything was as she had left it. The pale blue walls adorned with photos of friends, her desk cluttered with notebooks and sketches. On the nightstand, a framed picture caught Henry's eye. It was a photo of Lily with a younger Emma Reed. They were laughing, arms draped over each other's shoulders, their faces glowing with the carefree joy of youth. Henry sat on the edge of the bed, the picture in his hands. He remembered meeting Emma once or twice during Lily's college years. She had been polite but reserved, her nervousness palpable in the presence of someone like him. He had dismissed her as a passing friend, unimportant to Lily's future. But clearly Emma had been more than that. The weight of his mistakes pressed down on him. He had spent so much time trying to mold Lily into his vision of success that he had missed the parts of her life that truly mattered. And now, those parts were coming back to confront him in the form of a grandson he had never met. Later that day, Henry sat in his study, staring at the contact information Jack had provided for Emma. His hand hovered over the phone, hesitating. What could he possibly say to her? How would she react to the man who had once dismissed her as a footnote in his daughter's life? Taking a deep breath, he dialed the number. The phone rang several times before a voice answered. "Hello." Emma's voice was wary, guarded. "Emma," Henry began, his tone steadier than he felt. "This is Henry Carter. I believe we need to talk." There was a long pause on the other end. "I don't see what we have to talk about," she said finally, her voice cold. "It's about Daniel," Henry said, cutting straight to the point. "I know he's Lily's son." Another silence followed, heavier this time. When Emma spoke again, her voice was sharp with anger. "And what? Now that you know, you think you can just walk into his life? Where were you all these years, Henry? Where were you when he needed you?" Her words stung, but Henry couldn't argue. "I didn't know," he said softly. If you had," Emma interrupted, "you would have done exactly what you did with Lily. You would have tried to control him, shape him into someone he's not. I protected him from that." Henry clenched his fist, swallowing the knot in his throat. "I'm not here to argue, Emma. I want to meet him. I want to know my grandson." There was another long pause. "Daniel doesn't need you," Emma said, her voice quieter now, but still firm. "He's lived his whole life without you. You can't just show up and expect everything to be fine." "I know I've made mistakes," Henry admitted. "But this is about more than me. This is about Daniel. Don't you think he deserves to know where he comes from?" Emma sighed, the exhaustion in her voice evident. "I'll talk to him," she said finally. "But don't expect too much, Henry. He's not the kind of person who forgives easily." The next few days were a blur of anxious waiting. Henry threw himself into work, trying to distract himself. But even the constant demands of his business empire couldn't keep his mind off Daniel. When Emma finally called back, her words were simple. "Daniel agreed to meet you." The meeting was set for a small cafe on the edge of town. It was a far cry from the upscale restaurants Henry was accustomed to, but he didn't care. He arrived early, choosing a quiet corner table where they could talk without interruption. When Daniel walked in, Henry's heart skipped a beat. The boy was the spitting image of Lily, the same dark hair, the same piercing blue eyes. But there was a guardedness in his expression, a wall that Henry knew wouldn't be easy to break down. "Daniel," Henry said, standing as the young man approached. "Mr. Carter," Daniel replied, his voice cool. "Please call me Henry," he said, gesturing to the seat across from him. Daniel sat, his posture stiff. "Mom said you wanted to meet me," he said bluntly. "So here I am." Henry took a deep breath. "Thank you for coming. I know this must be unexpected." "Unexpected?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "That's an understatement." There was a long silence as they studied each other, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. "I want to start by saying I'm sorry," Henry said finally. "I didn't know about you, Daniel." "If I had." "You didn't know because you didn't want to know," Daniel interrupted. "Mom told me what you were like, how you pushed my mom away, how you treated Lily. You think showing up now makes up for that?" His words hit Henry like a blow, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You're right," he admitted. "I failed Lily in many ways, and I failed you by extension. But I'm here now, trying to make things right. That's all I can do." Daniel's eyes softened slightly, but his guard remained up. "Why now?" he asked. "Why do you care all of a sudden?" "Because I've lost too much already," Henry said, his voice cracking. I can't change the past, but I want to be part of your future if you'll let me. Daniel leaned back, studying him. I don't need your money, if that's what you're offering. Henry shook his head. I'm not offering money. I'm offering time. Whatever it takes to get to know you. The young man didn't respond immediately, his expression unreadable. I'll think about it, he said, finally standing. As he walked away, Henry felt a mixture of hope and uncertainty. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, he felt he had a purpose. Henry Carter couldn't focus. Not on the quarterly reports spread across his desk, not on the phone calls demanding his attention, and certainly not on the stream of emails lighting up his screen. His thoughts kept drifting back to Daniel. The boy's blue eyes haunted him, so strikingly similar to Lily's, yet clouded with resentment Henry couldn't ignore. After their tense meeting at the cafe, Daniel hadn't reached out again. Henry understood why. Trust wasn't something he could expect to rebuild overnight. But he wasn't a man accustomed to waiting, especially not when so much was at stake. For the first time in years, he found himself unsure of what to do next. The answer came in the form of a photograph. Henry sat in his study that evening, staring at an envelope that had arrived earlier from Jack Harmon, his private investigator. Jack had done exactly what Henry asked, discreetly gather information about Daniel and his mother, Emma. Henry hesitated before opening it, as though the contents might change everything. And in a way, they did. The first photograph was of Daniel standing outside a hardware store, his hands tucked into his pockets and his shoulders hunched against the cold. He looked young, far too young to carry the weight Henry suspected he did. The next photo showed Emma, a petite woman with auburn hair streaked with gray, holding a grocery bag as she walked into a modest brick building. The last photo froze Henry in place. It was of Lily, holding a baby bundled in a bright blue blanket. The date scrawled on the back, March 2nd, 20 years ago, sent a wave of emotion crashing over him. He hadn't known Lily was pregnant at the time, hadn't realized she was hiding something so monumental. The envelope included a short report as well. Jack's meticulous notes outlined Emma's life after college, her decision to keep Daniel, her struggle to make ends meet while working as a seamstress, and her refusal to reach out to the Carter family for help. Jack's final note was brief but cutting. Emma made it clear to her friends that she didn't want Daniel to grow up under the Carter shadow. Henry set the papers aside, his hands trembling slightly. It wasn't anger he felt, though part of him wanted to be angry at Emma for shutting him out. Instead, it was guilt, heavy and all-encompassing. He had pushed Lily so hard to fit into his world that she had chosen to keep this part of her life a secret. And now, Daniel had grown up without the support he could have offered. The next day, Henry drove to the address listed in Jack's report. The building was a small, aging apartment complex, its brick facade cracked and weathered. It stood in stark contrast to the gleaming skyscrapers that bore the Carter name, a physical reminder of the divide between Henry's world and Emma's. He parked his car and stepped onto the uneven sidewalk, the cold air biting at his face. Each step toward the front door felt heavier than the last. He had built an empire on confidence and control, but here, on this worn-out street, he felt completely out of place. Emma answered the door after his first knock. Her eyes widened when she saw him, but her expression quickly hardened into one of suspicion. "Henry," she said flatly, stepping outside and closing the door behind her. "I wasn't expecting you." "I needed to see you," he replied, his voice steady despite the tension between them. "I've spent the last few days trying to process everything, and I realized I owe you an apology." Emma folded her arms, her posture defensive. "An apology? For what?" "For everything," Henry said simply. "For how I treated you when Lily brought you into her life. For being the kind of father who made her feel like she couldn't tell me the truth. And for not being there for Daniel when I should have been." Her gaze softened, but only slightly. "I didn't keep Daniel from you to hurt you, Henry," she said after a long pause. "I did it to protect him. I didn't want him growing up in a world where he felt like he wasn't good enough." Henry nodded, her words cutting deeper than he expected. "I understand that now. But I want to be part of his life, Emma. I don't expect it to be easy, and I know I've already missed so much. But I'm willing to try, if you'll let me." Emma studied him for a moment, as though trying to gauge the sincerity of his words. Finally, she sighed. Daniel doesn't trust easily. You'll have to earn it. But if you're serious, I won't stand in your way. The conversation with Emma left Henry both hopeful and apprehensive. She had agreed to talk to Daniel on his behalf, but there were no guarantees. Henry spent the next few days waiting for her call, his nerves frayed in a way he hadn't experienced since his earliest days in business. When Emma finally called, her words were cautious but encouraging. He's willing to meet with you again, she said. But on his terms. Don't push him, Henry. He'll walk away if he feels like you're trying to control him. I understand, Henry replied, though he wasn't entirely sure he did. Control was second nature to him, a reflex honed by years of navigating boardrooms and negotiations. Letting go of that instinct would be a challenge. Their second meeting took place at a park near Daniel's apartment. The setting was quieter, more neutral, and less intimidating than the cafe where they'd first spoken. Henry arrived early, as he always did, and found a bench overlooking a small pond. Daniel arrived a few minutes later, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. He approached cautiously, his expression unreadable. Thanks for coming, Henry said, standing to greet him. Daniel nodded, but didn't sit right away. Mom said you wanted to talk. I do, Henry said, gesturing to the bench. I want to understand you, Daniel. Who you are, what your life has been like. I want to hear it from you, not from a report. Daniel hesitated before sitting down, keeping a careful distance between them. Why now? He asked, his tone skeptical. You've had 20 years to figure this out. What changed? Henry took a deep breath. Losing Lily changed me, he admitted. I've spent the last 2 years grieving her, regretting all the ways I failed her. And then, when I saw you at her grave, it felt like I was being given another chance. A chance to make things right. Daniel's gaze softened slightly, though his guard didn't drop completely. It's not going to be that simple, he said. I don't expect it to be, Henry replied, but I'm willing to do the work. If you'll let me. The two sat in silence for a moment, the sound of the wind rustling the trees filling the space between them. Finally, Daniel spoke. I'll think about it, he said, standing up, but don't expect me to jump into this. I'm not ready for that. I understand, Henry said, standing as well. Take whatever time you need. I'll be here. As Daniel walked away, Henry felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't a reconciliation, not yet, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. Henry Carter couldn't stop thinking about Daniel's words. It's not going to be that simple. They echoed in his mind, stark and unyielding. Yet, something about Daniel's tone, a faint crack in his armor, had left Henry cautiously optimistic. It wasn't rejection, it was hesitation. And Henry could work with that. The day after their second meeting, Henry decided to revisit the source of the boy's guardedness, Emma Reed. If he wanted to bridge the chasm between himself and Daniel, he needed to understand the life Emma had built for her son, the life Henry had missed entirely. Emma's apartment was a modest, weathered complex, its brick exterior dulled by years of wear. When Henry knocked on her door, he could hear the faint sound of a television inside, followed by hurried footsteps. The door opened just enough for Emma to peek out. When she saw Henry, her expression hardened, but she opened the door wider. You don't give up, do you? She said, crossing her arms. Persistence is my specialty, Henry replied with a faint smile, though he doubted she would appreciate his attempt at humor. I was hoping we could talk. I'd like to hear your side of things. Emma hesitated, but finally stepped aside, motioning him in. The apartment was small but tidy, its furnishings simple yet inviting. A crocheted blanket draped over the worn couch caught Henry's eye, a reminder of how different this world was from his own. He sat in the chair Emma gestured to, while she perched on the edge of the couch, her posture defensive. Talk then, she said, her tone clipped. Henry clasped his hands together, choosing his words carefully. I wanted to thank you, he began, for raising Daniel, for giving him a life when I wasn't there to help. Emma's eyes narrowed, her wariness evident. Let me guess. Now you want to swoop in and play the hero? You think a few apologies and some grand gestures will fix everything? I'm not trying to fix everything, Henry said quietly. I know I can't undo the past, but I want to understand it. I want to know why Lily didn't tell me about Daniel, why you kept him away from me. Maybe if I understand, I can do better now. Emma exhaled, her shoulders slumping slightly. Lily didn't tell you because she was afraid of you, she said, her voice laced with frustration. She was afraid of your expectations, afraid of disappointing you. And she knew how you'd react to us. Henry winced but stayed silent, letting her continue. When she found out she was pregnant, she came to me in tears, Emma said, her voice softening as she spoke of Lily. She said she didn't know how to tell you. She was terrified you'd demand she give up the baby, that you'd see it as some kind of failure. So, she made a choice. She moved out, cut ties, and focused on raising Daniel the best she could. Henry's chest tightened. The image of Lily, pregnant and scared, was almost too much to bear. "And what about you?" he asked after a moment. "Why didn't you come to me after she was gone?" Emma's gaze hardened again. "Because I didn't want Daniel growing up in a world where he had to earn your love. Lily spent her whole life trying to meet your standards, and look where it got her. I wasn't going to let that happen to him." Her words hit like a hammer. Henry had always believed he'd pushed Lily for her own good, to help her succeed. But now he saw the other side of the coin, the crushing weight of his expectations, the way they had driven her away. "I never wanted to hurt her," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I thought I was helping." Emma shook her head. "You didn't see what it did to her, Henry. You were so focused on the future you wanted for her that you didn't see the present she was drowning in." Silence fell between them, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. After a few moments, Emma sighed and leaned back against the couch. "I'll admit, Daniel's curious about you. He won't say it outright, but I can tell. He wants to know where he comes from, but he's also scared. He doesn't trust easily, and I can't blame him for that." Henry nodded, his resolve hardening. "I'm willing to take things at his pace. I don't want to push him. I just want to be there in whatever way he'll let me." Emma studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she said, "He needs time, Henry. Don't rush this. If you really want to be part of his life, you'll have to prove it." When Henry left the apartment, he felt both drained and determined. Emma's words lingered in his mind, a stark reminder of the damage his past actions had caused. But they also gave him clarity. This wasn't just about mending his relationship with Daniel. It was about breaking the cycle of control and expectation that had driven Lily away. For the next week, Henry threw himself into finding ways to connect with Daniel without overwhelming him. He asked Emma for suggestions, keeping their conversations brief to avoid overstepping. She mentioned Daniel's love of working with his hands, especially fixing things, and suggested starting there. Henry thought back to the old car sitting in his garage, a project Lily had started in high school but never finished. It had been gathering dust for years, its potential unrealized. He decided it was the perfect opportunity. Henry called Daniel one evening, his nerves uncharacteristically frayed as he waited for the boy to pick up. When Daniel's voice came through, it was cautious but curious. "Hey," Daniel said. "What's up? I was wondering if you'd like to work on something with me," Henry said, doing his best to keep his tone casual. "I've got an old car in my garage, a restoration project I never got around to. I thought it might be something we could tackle together." Daniel was silent for a moment. "Why?" he asked finally. "Because I want to spend time with you," Henry said honestly. "No strings attached. Just something we could do together." There was another pause before Daniel replied. "I'll think about it," he said, his tone guarded but not dismissive. "That's all I ask," Henry said, a small smile forming despite the uncertainty. The sound of the garage door creaking open echoed in the still air of Henry Carter's estate. Dust motes danced in the sunlight, streaming through the high windows, settling on an old, unfinished car project that had once been Lily's pride. The vehicle, a classic 1970s Mustang, stood dormant, its faded red paint chipped and rust creeping along the edges. Henry leaned against the workbench, running a hand over the hood. The sight was bittersweet. He remembered how Lily had begged for the car as a restoration project during her high school years. She had spent hours in this garage, her laughter and music filling the space. But as college and life pulled her away, the Mustang had been left to decay. This car, he realized, could be a bridge between the past and the future. He didn't know if Daniel would accept his offer, but the thought of working on it together gave Henry a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The next afternoon, Daniel arrived at the estate. Emma had driven him, her cautious glance surveying the mansion as if it were a fortress. Henry met them at the door, his demeanor uncharacteristically tentative. "Thank you for coming," Henry said, his voice steady but humble. Emma nodded but didn't linger. "I'll pick him up in a few hours," she said, squeezing Daniel's shoulder before walking back to her car. Daniel stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over the polished floors and grand staircase with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. "This place is big," he said flatly. "It's a bit much for just one person," Henry admitted, leading Daniel toward the garage. "I've been meaning to downsize, but I guess I never got around to it." They entered the garage, and Daniel stopped short, his eyes landing on the Mustang. "Wow," he muttered, stepping closer. "Is this a '72 Mustang? You don't see these around much anymore." Henry's heart lifted at the spark of interest in Daniel's voice. "Good eye. It is. It belonged to Lily." Daniel glanced at him, his expression shifting. "She worked on this?" "She started to," Henry said, "but life got in the way. I thought maybe we could finish what she started together." Daniel ran a hand over the hood, his fingers brushing away a layer of dust. "You really think we can bring this back to life?" "With the right tools and a little patience, I think so," Henry replied. "What do you say?" Daniel hesitated, his guarded demeanor faltering as curiosity won out. "All right," he said finally. "Let's give it a shot." The first few hours were slow, filled with careful observation and tentative conversation. Henry watched as Daniel inspected the engine, his movements methodical and precise. The boy's familiarity with the inner workings of the car surprised him. "You seem to know your way around an engine," Henry remarked, handing Daniel a wrench. "Mom taught me the basics," Daniel said, not looking up, "and I've picked up the rest fixing things around the apartment. It's kind of my thing, making broken stuff work again." Henry nodded, the irony of Daniel's words not lost on him. "You've got a talent for it," he said sincerely. Daniel shrugged but didn't respond, keeping his focus on the task at hand. As the afternoon wore on, the tension between them began to ease. They worked in companionable silence, broken occasionally by the sound of tools clinking and the hum of the garage heater. Henry found himself marveling at Daniel's patience and attention to detail, qualities that reminded him so much of Lily. At one point, Daniel paused, wiping his hands on a rag. "Why do you care about this so much?" he asked, his tone cautious but genuine. "I mean the car, I mean all of it." Henry set down the socket wrench he had been holding and leaned against the workbench, choosing his words carefully. "Because I made a mistake," he admitted. "I spent so much time trying to control Lily's life that I didn't see what really mattered. And when I lost her, I thought I'd lost my chance to make things right. Then I met you, and it felt like maybe I was being given another chance." Daniel studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "It's not that simple," he said finally. "I know," Henry replied, "and I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. But I'm willing to put in the work if you'll let me." By the time Emma returned, the car's hood was propped open, and the father and grandson were deep in conversation about the ignition system. Emma watched from the doorway, her arms crossed, but her gaze softening as she saw the cautious camaraderie between them. "How's it going in here?" she asked, stepping into the garage. Daniel glanced up, his face streaked with grease but relaxed. "Not bad," he said. "It's going to take a while, but I think we can do it." Emma raised an eyebrow. "We?" Daniel shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, we." After Emma and Daniel left, Henry stood in the garage, staring at the Mustang. The space, once hollow and quiet, now felt alive again. It wasn't just the sound of tools or the promise of progress, it was the feeling of connection, however tentative, that had taken root between him and Daniel. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still so many bridges to build, so many walls to break down. But for the first time in years, Henry felt hopeful. This wasn't just about fixing a car. It was about rebuilding a family. The next Saturday morning, Henry Carter opened the garage door, the chilly autumn air mingling with the scent of motor oil and rust. It had been a week since Daniel agreed to help restore the Mustang, and Henry had spent the days preparing for their next session. He had ordered replacement parts, cleaned up the workspace, and stocked up on tools. Yet, despite his efforts to create the perfect environment, anxiety lingered in the back of his mind. He wasn't used to feeling nervous. Negotiating multi-million-dollar deals? Easy. Talking to a 20-year-old grandson? That was a different story. Daniel arrived right on time, carrying a worn backpack slung over one shoulder. He was dressed in a gray hoodie and jeans, a far cry from the polished suits Henry was used to, but there was something about Daniel's no-nonsense demeanor that Henry found grounding. "Morning," Daniel said, his tone casual but polite. "Morning," Henry replied, gesturing toward the garage. "Everything's ready. I thought we could start with the carburetor today. It's in pretty bad shape." Daniel nodded, stepping inside and surveying the workbench. "Looks like you've been busy." "I wanted to make sure we had everything we'd need," Henry said. Daniel set down his bag and pulled out a pair of gloves. "All right, let's get to it." For the first hour, they worked mostly in silence. Henry handed Daniel tools as requested, occasionally offering a suggestion or observation. Daniel seemed more at ease than during their first meeting, his focus on the car providing a buffer against the tension that still lingered between them. "Did Lily ever talk about this project?" Daniel asked suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. Henry paused, the question catching him off guard. "She did actually," he said. "She was so excited when we bought it. She used to bring her friends over to show it off. But as she got older, she had less time for it. Schoolwork, life got in the way." Daniel glanced at him. "Did you help her with it?" Henry hesitated. "Not as much as I should have. I was busy with work most of the time, and if I'm honest, I didn't think it was a good use of her time. I wanted her to focus on things that mattered more." Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't respond. Henry sighed, sensing the tension returning. "I was wrong," he admitted. "I see that now. I should have supported her, no matter what she wanted to do." Daniel's expression softened, though his voice remained guarded. "She didn't talk much about you," he said. "Whenever I asked, she'd just say you were busy." Henry felt the weight of those words settle over him. "I regret that more than anything," he said quietly. "I spent so much time focused on building my business. I forgot to build a relationship with her. I thought I had more time." As the morning wore on, the conversation ebbed and flowed. They discussed the car's engine, Daniel's favorite tools, and even a few memories of Lily. Slowly, the barriers between them began to erode, replaced by a tentative understanding. By midday, they had removed the carburetor and placed it on the workbench. Daniel leaned against the table, wiping his hands on a rag. "So, what made you decide to reach out?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. Henry set down a wrench, meeting Daniel's gaze. "Seeing you at the cemetery," he said. "It was like being hit with a bolt of lightning. I realized how much of Lily's life I had missed, how much of your life I didn't even know about. I couldn't ignore that." Daniel crossed his arms. "And what happens when you get tired of this? When it's not convenient for you anymore?" Henry's stomach clenched. "I deserve that question," he said. "But the truth is, this isn't about convenience. It's about making things right. I don't expect you to trust me right away, but I'm here for the long haul. That's a promise." Daniel studied him for a moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. Finally, he nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's see if you mean it." After lunch, they tackled the Mustang's interior, pulling out the cracked leather seats and discussing options for replacing them. Daniel seemed more relaxed, occasionally cracking a small joke or sharing a story about a repair job he had done for a neighbor. "Ever thought about doing this professionally?" Henry asked as Daniel inspected the dashboard. Daniel shrugged. "I've thought about it. I like working with my hands, solving problems, but college isn't exactly in the budget." Henry frowned, the idea of financial constraints foreign to him. "If you wanted to go, I'd be happy to help." Daniel shot him a wary look. "I'm not a charity case." "I didn't mean it like that," Henry said quickly. "I just meant that if you needed support, advice, connections, whatever, I'd be here for you." Daniel relaxed slightly, but didn't respond, returning his focus to the dashboard. By the time Emma arrived to pick him up, they had made significant progress on the Mustang. The garage was littered with tools and parts, but the car already looked less like a forgotten relic and more like a project coming to life. "How'd it go?" Emma asked, stepping into the garage. Daniel wiped his hands on his jeans, a hint of a smile on his face. "Not bad. We got a lot done." Emma glanced at Henry, her expression softer than usual. "Looks like you two are making progress." Henry nodded. We are. Slowly but surely. As Daniel gathered his things, Henry felt a pang of reluctance. He didn't want the day to end. Didn't want the fragile connection they had built to fade. Same time next week, he asked as Daniel slung his backpack over his shoulder. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, same time. The following week, Henry Carter prepared for Daniel's visit with the same care and precision he once reserved for his high-stakes business meetings. He cleared the workbench, laid out the tools, and made sure the replacement parts for the Mustang were ready to go. Each task helped settle his nerves, though it did little to quiet the nagging question in his mind. Would Daniel show up? It was 10 minutes past their scheduled time when Henry heard the crunch of gravel in the driveway. Relief swept over him as Daniel stepped out of a beat-up sedan, a backpack slung casually over one shoulder. Sorry I'm late, Daniel said as he approached, his tone neutral but not unfriendly. You're right on time, Henry replied with a small smile. Come on in. As they worked on the Mustang, their conversation was lighter than the previous week. They talked about tools, the best way to clean corrosion off engine parts, and even a few of Daniel's recent odd jobs. Henry found himself relaxing in Daniel's presence, appreciating the younger man's quiet confidence and quick wit. At one point, Daniel paused to inspect a particularly stubborn bolt. This thing's rusted solid, he muttered, reaching for a can of penetrating oil. Let me give it a shot, Henry offered, taking the wrench. He applied the oil, waited a moment, then carefully worked the bolt free. Daniel gave a low whistle. Not bad. You might actually be useful after all. Henry chuckled, the good-natured jab surprising him. High praise coming from you. For the first time, Daniel's lips curved into a faint smile. As the afternoon wore on, Henry decided to take a chance. Daniel, he said, setting down a wrench. I've been thinking, would you be interested in coming by the house for dinner sometime? Maybe bring your mom? Daniel straightened, his expression guarded. Dinner? Nothing formal, Henry said quickly. Just a chance for us to sit down, talk, and maybe get to know each other a little better. No expectations. Daniel hesitated, the wrench in his hand still. I'll think about it, he said finally. That's all I can ask, Henry replied, forcing himself not to push further. When Daniel left that evening, Henry was struck by how much lighter he felt. The hours spent working together had been filled with tentative but genuine connection. He couldn't remember the last time he had enjoyed someone's company so much. Still, Henry knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Emma's caution and Daniel's wariness were reminders of the damage his absence had caused. But for the first time, Henry felt like he was moving in the right direction. A few days later, Emma called. Daniel told me about your dinner invitation, she said, her tone careful. I hope I didn't overstep, Henry said. You didn't, Emma replied. He's considering it. That's more than I expected. Henry's heart lifted. That's good to hear. Emma paused, then added, Don't push too hard, Henry. He's still figuring out how he feels about all this. I understand, Henry said. I'll take it one step at a time. The following Saturday, Daniel arrived at the estate with a new energy. He strode into the garage, his backpack heavier than usual. What's all this? Henry asked, nodding at the bag. Thought I'd bring some of my tools, Daniel said, setting the bag down. Figured they might come in handy. Henry smiled. I'm glad you did. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, dismantling the car's rusted exhaust system and discussing possible replacements. Henry couldn't help but notice how much more at ease Daniel seemed. The younger man's movements were more confident, his comments more relaxed. Eventually, Daniel broke the silence. About that dinner, Henry set down a socket wrench, trying to keep his tone neutral. Yes, Mom and I talked about it, Daniel said, his voice steady but cautious. We'll come, but only if it's casual. No fancy dinners or anything like that. Henry smiled, relief washing over him. Casual it is, just family. Henry spent the next few days preparing for the dinner, taking care to keep it simple. He hired a local caterer to provide hearty, home-cooked dishes and set the dining room table with understated elegance. The thought of Emma and Daniel sitting around that table filled him with both anticipation and nerves. When the evening arrived, Henry greeted them at the door with a genuine smile. Emma looked slightly uncomfortable, but Daniel appeared calm, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. Come in, Henry said, stepping aside. The meal started awkwardly, with polite conversation about the weather and Daniel's odd jobs. But as the evening wore on, the atmosphere began to relax. Emma shared a few stories about Daniel's childhood, while Daniel cracked a joke about one of his more disastrous repair jobs. By dessert, the conversation turned to Lily. She loved this house, Emma said softly, her gaze drifting to the tall windows. She used to talk about how much it meant to her, even after she moved out. Henry nodded, his throat tight. She had a way of bringing life to every room she walked into. Daniel looked down at his plate, his expression unreadable. I wish I'd known her better, he said quietly. Henry's heart ached at the words. I think she'd be proud of you, he said. I know I am. Daniel glanced at him, something unspoken passing between them. After dinner, Emma and Daniel prepared to leave. As they stood in the doorway, Henry felt a wave of gratitude. For the first time in years, his home felt warm, alive, a far cry from the cold, hollow place it had been since Lily's death. Thank you for coming, he said, his voice sincere. Emma nodded. Thank you for having us. Daniel offered a small smile. See you next weekend? Henry nodded, his chest swelling with hope. Absolutely. The Mustang sat in the middle of the garage, its stripped-down frame catching the sunlight streaming through the wide windows. For weeks, it had been the focal point of Henry and Daniel's Saturday afternoons, their shared effort slowly breathing life back into the forgotten car. But for Henry, the Mustang had become something more, a symbol of their budding connection. Each nut and bolt they tightened together felt like a small piece of trust being built, one conversation at a time. This Saturday began like the others, with Daniel arriving in his usual casual attire, his tools slung over one shoulder. Henry greeted him at the door with a warm smile. Ready to get your hands dirty? Henry asked, leading Daniel into the garage. Always, Daniel replied, his tone lighter than it had been in their earlier meetings. Today's task was the transmission. The old one was beyond repair, so Henry had ordered a refurbished replacement. Daniel crouched beside the car, studying the undercarriage. We'll need to remove the old one first, he said, pulling on his gloves. Henry handed him a wrench. You lead, I'll follow. Daniel glanced up, a small grin tugging at his lips. All right, but if this falls on your foot, don't blame me. Henry chuckled, grateful for the humor. As they worked, the conversation flowed naturally. They talked about the different models of Mustangs, debated the merits of manual versus automatic transmissions, and even drifted into lighter topics like favorite movies and music. So, you're into classic rock? Daniel asked, tightening a bolt. Henry nodded. Lily and I used to listen to it on road trips. She loved Fleetwood Mac. Daniel paused, his expression softening. Mom used to play their songs when I was little. Said Lily got her hooked. A comfortable silence fell between them, the shared memory of Lily creating an unspoken bond. By midday, they had successfully removed the old transmission and were preparing to install the new one. Henry wiped his hands on a rag, glancing at Daniel. You're good at this, he said. Have you ever thought about making a career out of it? Daniel shrugged, his expression thoughtful. I've thought about it. I like working with my hands, solving problems. But college isn't exactly an option right now. Henry hesitated, choosing his words carefully. If you wanted to pursue it, I'd be happy to support you. Not with money, necessarily, just guidance, connections, whatever you'd need. Daniel looked up, his brow furrowed. Why? Because I see potential in you, Henry said simply. And because I want to help you succeed on your terms. Daniel studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. I'll think about it. Later that afternoon, as they secured the new transmission, Daniel glanced at Henry. Why did you push Lily so hard? He asked, his tone cautious but curious. Henry froze for a moment, the question catching him off guard. He set down his wrench, leaning against the workbench. I thought I was doing what was best for her, he admitted. I wanted her to be successful, to have every opportunity one never had growing up. But looking back, I see now that I pushed too hard. I wanted her to follow my path, and I didn't listen when she tried to tell me it wasn't what she wanted. Daniel nodded, his expression pensive. Mom said she was always scared of disappointing you. Henry's chest tightened. That's one of my biggest regrets, he said quietly. I wish I could go back and tell her that she didn't need to be perfect, that I loved her for who she was. But I can't. All I can do now is try to be better for you. Daniel didn't respond immediately, but when he did, his voice was softer. She never hated you, you know? She just wanted you to see her for who she was. The words hit Henry like a punch to the gut. For years, he had carried the weight of his mistakes, fearing that Lily had resented him. Hearing Daniel's perspective felt like both a wound and a balm. "Thank you for telling me that," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. By the end of the day, the transmission was in place, and the Mustang was one step closer to running again. Daniel stood back, wiping sweat from his brow as he surveyed their progress. "It's starting to look like a real car again," he said with a hint of pride. "It's thanks to you," Henry replied. Daniel glanced at him, his expression thoughtful. "It's thanks to us," he said after a moment. The simple statement filled Henry with a sense of hope he hadn't felt in years. When Emma arrived to pick Daniel up, she noticed the subtle change in her son's demeanor. "Good day?" she asked as he climbed into the car. "Yeah," Daniel said, glancing back at the garage. "It was." Emma looked at him, her curiosity piqued. "He's trying, isn't he?" Daniel nodded, his gaze distant. "Yeah, he is." The following Saturday, Henry found himself pacing in the garage. Despite the steady rhythm of their weekly work on the Mustang, there was still a fragility to his relationship with Daniel, like walking on thin ice. Every shared moment brought them closer, but Henry was acutely aware of how easily it could all fall apart. When Daniel arrived, his usual backpack slung over one shoulder, Henry greeted him warmly. "Morning. Ready to tackle the electrical system?" Daniel grinned faintly. "Sure. If we mess it up, maybe we'll make a fireworks show out of it." Henry chuckled, handing him a set of pliers. "Let's try to avoid that." As they worked, the conversation drifted to lighter topics. Daniel's favorite tools, a particularly tricky repair job he had recently done for a neighbor, and Henry's long-forgotten attempts at DIY projects during his early career. "I tried fixing a leaky faucet once," Henry admitted, shaking his head. "Flooded the kitchen instead." Daniel laughed, his guard slipping for a moment. "Remind me not to let you near the plumbing." It was moments like this that gave Henry hope. Yet he couldn't ignore the stark differences in their lives, differences that would inevitably bubble to the surface. By midday, the topic turned to Daniel's plans for the future. "Have you thought more about college?" Henry asked, his tone careful. Daniel shrugged, tightening a bolt. "I don't know. It sounds great in theory, but it's expensive, and I don't want to get into debt over something I'm not even sure about." Henry leaned against the workbench, considering his words. "I understand where you're coming from, but you're talented, Daniel. If you wanted to pursue something like automotive engineering, I think you'd excel." Daniel set down the wrench, his expression guarded. "And what? You're going to swoop in and pay for it? Give me a nice little trust fund to make everything easy?" The edge in his voice took Henry by surprise. "That's not what I meant," he said, keeping his tone steady. "I'm not offering to throw money at you. I'm offering to support you in a way that works for you, whether that's advice, connections, or just someone to bounce ideas off." Daniel crossed his arms. "I've spent my whole life figuring things out on my own. I don't need someone to come in and fix everything for me." "I'm not trying to fix you," Henry replied, his voice quiet but firm. "I just want to help, but only if you want it." The tension hung in the air like a storm cloud, but before it could escalate further, Henry changed the subject. "Let's take a break. Lunch is on me." Daniel hesitated, but eventually nodded. "All right." They drove to a small diner nearby, the kind of place with red vinyl booths and a handwritten menu on the wall. Henry followed Daniel's lead, ordering a burger and fries instead of the steak salad he might have chosen otherwise. As they ate, the conversation was stilted at first, but eventually Daniel's curiosity got the better of him. "What was Lily like when she was younger?" he asked, his tone softening. Henry smiled wistfully. "She was fearless, always climbing trees, riding her bike too fast, and bringing home stray animals. I used to call her my little hurricane." Daniel chuckled. "Mom used to say she was the only person who could talk sense into a room full of chaos." "She had a way of doing that," Henry agreed. "But as she got older, I think I forgot to let her be herself. I was so focused on wanting her to succeed, I didn't see how much pressure I was putting on her." Daniel's smile faded. "She never said anything bad about you," he said after a moment. "She just didn't talk about you much." Henry felt the weight of those words settle over him. "I wish I could go back and fix that," he said quietly. "But I can't. All I can do is try to do better now with you." As they drove back to the estate, the tension between them seemed to have eased, but Henry knew the divide between their worlds was still there, waiting to resurface. That afternoon, Emma arrived to pick Daniel up earlier than usual. Henry walked them to the car, feeling a mix of satisfaction and apprehension. "How's it going?" Emma asked as Daniel climbed into the passenger seat. "Good," Henry replied, glancing at Daniel. "We're making progress on the car and everything else." Emma nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Keep it that way." As they drove away, Henry stood in the driveway, staring after them. He couldn't shake the feeling that despite their progress, there was still so much left unsaid, so many barriers to overcome. But he wasn't giving up. Not now. The garage was quiet, save for the steady tick of a cooling engine. Henry Carter stood at the workbench, meticulously organizing the tools he and Daniel had used earlier that day. Though their afternoon had gone smoothly, Henry couldn't shake the unease he felt. He had sensed something in Daniel's demeanor, a subtle shift, like the undercurrent of a storm. Their conversations had been growing deeper, more personal, but with each revelation, Henry felt the fragile walls between them tremble. He wondered if Daniel was building up to something, holding back words that might fracture the progress they'd made. The question came the following Saturday. "Why did you really push Lily so hard?" Daniel asked abruptly, his voice cutting through the hum of the garage heater. Henry paused, a wrench in his hand. They had been working on the Mustang suspension system, the rhythm of their shared task lulling them into a rare ease. But now, Daniel's question hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. "I wanted her to succeed," Henry said finally, his voice careful. "I wanted her to have every opportunity one didn't have." "That's not all of it," Daniel said, his tone edged with something sharper. Henry set the wrench down and turned to face him. "What are you asking, Daniel?" Daniel met his gaze, his blue eyes burning with intensity. "Did you ever stop to think about what she wanted? Or was it always about you?" The words hit Henry like a blow. He opened his mouth to respond, but found himself at a loss. "I used to think about her all the time," Daniel continued, his voice quieter now, but no less piercing. "About what she was like, why she didn't talk much about you. And the more I learned, the more I realized she didn't talk about you because you made her feel like she wasn't enough." Henry's chest tightened. "That wasn't my intention," he said, his voice rough. "Maybe not," Daniel said, crossing his arms. "But that's what happened." Henry took a step back, leaning against the workbench as he tried to gather his thoughts. The weight of Daniel's words pressed down on him, forcing him to confront truths he had long buried. "I didn't see it then," Henry admitted after a long silence. "I thought I was helping her. I thought I was preparing her for the world. But I see now that I was wrong. I didn't give her the space to be herself, to make her own choices." Daniel's gaze softened, but the tension in his posture remained. "She didn't hate you," he said quietly. "She was just scared to disappoint you. Mom used to say that all the time." Henry felt his heart clench. "That's the last thing I ever wanted. But I can't undo the past, Daniel. All I can do now is learn from it and try to be better for you." Daniel studied him for a long moment, the anger in his expression giving way to something more subdued. "You've got a lot to make up for," he said finally. "I know," Henry replied, his voice steady, "and I'm willing to do whatever it takes." The tension eased slightly as they returned to the car, but the conversation lingered in Henry's mind. He couldn't stop replaying Daniel's words, each one a reminder of the mistakes he had made, the ways he had failed the daughter he had loved so deeply. But amidst the pain, there was also a glimmer of hope. Daniel hadn't shut him out completely. He had spoken his truth, and in doing so, opened a door Henry had feared would remain closed forever. That evening, Henry sat alone in his study, staring at an old photograph of Lily. It was taken during her high school graduation, her smile bright and full of promise. He remembered how proud he had been of her that day, but now, looking at the photo, he wondered if she had been smiling for him or in spite of him. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I should have done better." He set the photo down and leaned back in his chair, the weight of his regret heavy, but not unbearable. For the first time, He felt a sense of purpose in his pain and determination to use it as a catalyst for change. The next day, Henry called Emma. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her tone cautious. "I think so," Henry said, "but I wanted to thank you for raising Daniel to be the man he is. He's extraordinary." Emma was silent for a moment, then said, "He's a good kid. But that's all him, Henry. He's had to grow up faster than he should have." Henry nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I'm trying to fix that," he said. "I just hope it's not too late." Emma sighed. "He's giving you a chance, isn't he? That's more than most people get." The following Saturday, Henry approached the garage with renewed determination. When Daniel arrived, they picked up where they had left off, working on the Mustang's wiring system. Their conversation was lighter this time, punctuated by the occasional joke or shared memory of Lily. But underneath it all, Henry could feel a subtle shift, a quiet acknowledgement of the progress they had made. "Hey," Daniel said suddenly, glancing up from the wiring. "Thanks for listening. About everything." Henry smiled, his chest swelling with a mix of relief and gratitude. "Thank you for trusting me enough to share it." Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We're not there yet," he said after a moment. "But maybe we're getting closer." Henry's smile widened. "Closer is all I can ask for." As the day drew to a close, they stepped back to admire their progress. The Mustang was beginning to look like a car again, its once dormant frame coming back to life piece by piece. Henry felt a surge of pride, not just in the car, but in the relationship he was building with Daniel. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that redemption was possible. The Mustang's restoration had become a ritual, the shared hours between Henry and Daniel slowly stitching together the fragile threads of their relationship. But beneath the progress lay an unspoken tension, one born of their clashing worlds, and the baggage neither fully knew how to unpack. That tension came to a head one chilly afternoon as they worked side by side in the garage. "We should get this done today," Daniel said, gesturing to the half-installed dashboard. "It's the last big piece before we can start testing the electrical system." "Agreed," Henry replied, handing him a screwdriver. For a while, the task absorbed them. But as the sun dipped lower in the sky, Henry decided to broach a subject that had been on his mind. "Daniel," he began cautiously, "I was thinking about what you said last week about college." Daniel stiffened slightly, but didn't look up. "What about it?" "Well," Henry said, choosing his words carefully, "I know you don't want financial help, but what if I offered you a chance to meet with some people in the automotive industry? They could give you advice, maybe even a path forward if you're interested." Daniel set down the screwdriver, his movements deliberate. "Why does everything with you have to be about connections?" he asked, his voice cool but sharp. Henry blinked, caught off guard. "I thought it might help," he said. "That's all." "Help who? Me or you?" Daniel asked, turning to face him. The question hit harder than Henry expected. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Daniel said, his tone rising, "that it feels like you're trying to fix everything with your influence, like you're trying to make up for the past by throwing opportunities at me. But that's not how this works." Henry's jaw tightened, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. "I'm not trying to fix everything, Daniel. I'm trying to be useful to support you in ways I couldn't support Lily." "That's the problem," Daniel said, his voice laced with frustration. "You're not listening to me. I don't need your connections or your advice. I've been figuring things out on my own for 20 years, and I'm fine." Henry took a deep breath, willing himself to stay calm. "I know you're capable, Daniel. I'm not questioning that. I just what?" Daniel interrupted. "You want to feel like you're doing something? Like you're the hero swooping in to save the day." Henry flinched, the accusation cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. "That's not fair," he said quietly. Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "Fair? You think any of this is fair? You show up out of nowhere, and now you want to be part of my life like none of this ever happened?" Henry's temper flared, his control slipping. "I'm trying, Daniel. Isn't that worth something?" Daniel shook his head, his expression a mix of anger and disappointment. "Trying doesn't erase 20 years. It doesn't make up for what you missed." The argument left the garage heavy with silence. Daniel grabbed his backpack, slinging it over his shoulder. "I need some air," he muttered, walking toward the door. "Daniel, wait," Henry called, but the younger man didn't stop. Henry stood alone in the garage, his hands clenched into fists. The Mustang, once a symbol of progress, now felt like a mocking reminder of how easily things could fall apart. That evening, Henry called Emma. "What happened?" she asked, her tone tinged with concern. "We had an argument," Henry admitted. "I tried to offer him some support connections in the industry, and he pushed back. Hard." Emma sighed. "You're used to solving problems your way, Henry. But Daniel's not like that. He doesn't want to feel like a project you're working on." "That's not how I see him," Henry said, his voice weary. "I just want to help." "Then let him come to you," Emma said gently. "Give him the space to figure things out. He'll come back when he's ready." The next few days were restless for Henry. The silence between him and Daniel gnawed at him, each passing hour a reminder of how fragile their relationship still was. He spent more time in the garage than usual, tinkering with the Mustang alone. Without Daniel's presence, the work felt hollow, each task a painful echo of the progress they had made together. One evening, as he tightened a bolt on the engine, he heard a knock at the garage door. He turned to see Daniel standing there, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. "Hey," Daniel said, his voice hesitant. "Hey," Henry replied, setting down the wrench. Daniel stepped inside, his gaze flickering to the Mustang. "You've been busy." "I needed something to keep me occupied," Henry said, his tone light but strained. Daniel nodded, his expression unreadable. "Look, about the other day," he began, shifting his weight. "I shouldn't have gone off like that. It's just hard, you know." "I know," Henry said softly. "And I'm sorry if I pushed too hard. I didn't mean to overstep." Daniel glanced at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and guilt. "I know you're trying. I do. But it's going to take time for both of us." Henry nodded, relief washing over him. "I can wait," he said, "as long as it takes." Daniel managed a small smile. "Good. Because I'm not giving up on this car, and it's going to need both of us to get it running." Henry chuckled, the tension between them finally easing. "Then let's get to work." The evening passed in a steady rhythm of conversation and collaboration, the rift between them beginning to mend. Henry knew the road ahead would still be rocky, but for now, he was grateful for the progress they had made. As Daniel packed up for the night, he paused at the garage door. "Thanks for being patient," he said, his voice sincere. Henry smiled. "Thanks for giving me the chance." The garage smelled faintly of oil and metal, the comforting aroma of progress that had come to define Henry and Daniel's Saturdays. But today, the air felt heavier. Henry could sense Daniel's tension the moment he arrived, his steps deliberate, his gaze distant. As they worked in silence, the Mustang's frame gleaming under the garage lights, Henry debated whether to address the elephant in the room. Emma's advice echoed in his mind. Give him space. Let him come to you. But patience had never been Henry's strength. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "You've been working on this car a lot, haven't you?" Henry glanced up from the engine. "Keeps me busy," he said, "but I prefer working on it with you." Daniel gave a small nod, though his expression remained unreadable. "I talked to Mom about everything," he said after a pause. Henry set down his wrench, leaning against the workbench. And she thinks I should set some boundaries," Daniel said, his voice steady but firm. Henry's chest tightened. "Boundaries?" "Yeah," Daniel said, turning to face him. "Look, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but sometimes it feels like too much. Like you're trying to fix everything all at once. I need you to back off a little and let me figure things out for myself." Henry swallowed the lump in his throat, Emma's warning replaying in his mind. He doesn't want to feel like a project. "I understand," he said carefully. "But can I ask what backing off looks like to you?" Daniel hesitated, clearly searching for the right words. "Stop trying to control everything," he said finally. "Stop offering solutions before I even know what the problem is. I need space to decide what I want, not what you think I should want." The conversation left Henry reeling. After Daniel left that evening, Henry sat in his study, staring at the untouched paperwork on his desk. His instincts screamed at him to do something, fix the situation, plan, but for the first time he realized that his instincts were the problem. For years, he had equated control with love, assuming that providing solutions meant providing support. But Daniel didn't want to fix her. He wanted someone who would listen, who would trust him to navigate his own path. The next week, Henry took a step back. He still called Daniel to confirm their Saturday plans, but he refrained from bringing up college, connections, or anything that might be construed as interference. When Saturday arrived, Henry let Daniel take the lead in the garage. The younger man approached the day's tasks with a quiet determination, his movements confident and precise. As they worked, the conversation remained light, an easy rhythm of shared observations and occasional jokes. "You're getting the hang of this," Daniel said as Henry successfully replaced a gasket. "Well, I have a good teacher," Henry replied, earning a rare grin from Daniel. As the afternoon wore on, Daniel seemed to relax, the tension of the previous week fading into the background. "You know," Daniel said, tightening a bolt on the suspension system, "Mom wasn't sure if I should keep coming here. She was worried it'd be too much." Henry paused, his heart sinking. "And what did you decide?" Daniel looked up, his expression thoughtful. "I told her I wanted to keep coming, but only if you're willing to meet me halfway." "Halfway?" "Yeah," Daniel said, setting down his wrench. "You don't try to fix everything, and I'll keep showing up." "Deal?" Henry extended a grease-stained hand. "Deal." Henry extended a grease-stained hand. "Deal." Daniel hesitated, then shook his hand, the gesture carrying more weight than Henry could have anticipated. That evening, Henry reflected on the conversation as he sat in the now familiar quiet of the garage. He realized that Daniel's ultimatum wasn't a rejection, it was a chance. A chance for Henry to prove he could respect Daniel's boundaries while still being present. He glanced at the Mustang, its restoration steadily nearing completion. Like the car, his relationship with Daniel wasn't perfect. It had dents and scratches, parts that needed replacing, and areas that required careful adjustment. But it was moving forward one step at a time. And for Henry, that was enough. The days leading up to the next Saturday were unusually quiet for Henry Carter. With Daniel's ultimatum still fresh in his mind, Henry resisted the urge to call and check in. He had agreed to meet Daniel halfway, but the silence left him restless. For a man who thrived on control, stepping back felt like trying to hold water in his hands. As he sat in his study one evening, Henry found himself staring at a framed photo of Lily. Taken during her senior year of high school, it captured her bright smile and wide eyes, full of hope for the future. The memory of her energy and determination brought a pang of guilt. He had pushed so hard back then, believing he was preparing her for success. But now, he couldn't help but wonder, had he been blind to what she truly needed? The next Saturday, Daniel arrived at the estate on time, his expression neutral but calm. "Morning," he said as he walked into the garage, his backpack slung over one shoulder. "Good morning," Henry replied, offering a small smile. "I thought we could tackle the brakes today. They're the last major safety issue before we can test the engine." Daniel nodded, setting his bag down. "Sounds good." The two got to work in companionable silence, the rhythmic clink of tools filling the space. Henry noticed how focused Daniel was, his brow furrowed as he inspected each part. "You're good at this," Henry said after a while, his voice genuine. Daniel glanced up. "Thanks. Mom always said I had a knack for fixing things." Henry hesitated before speaking again. "She did an incredible job raising you." Daniel straightened, his gaze meeting Henry's. "She didn't have much of a choice." The words were matter of fact, not bitter, but they landed like a weight in Henry's chest. As they worked, the conversation shifted to lighter topics: Daniel's recent odd jobs, the quirks of old cars, and even a few jokes about the outdated tools Henry still kept in the garage. But beneath the surface, Henry sensed an opportunity, a chance to address something deeper. When they paused for lunch, Henry decided to take it. "Daniel," he began, his tone careful, "can I ask you something?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Sure. Do you ever think about her? About Lily?" Daniel leaned back against the workbench, his expression softening. "All the time," he admitted. "I think about what she was like, what she would have been like if she'd been around longer. Mom used to tell me stories, but I always wanted to hear them from her, you know?" Henry nodded, his throat tight. "She would have wanted to tell you," he said. "She was proud of you, even before you were born. She used to talk about how excited she was to be a mom." Daniel's eyes flickered with emotion, but he stayed quiet, waiting for Henry to continue. "I didn't give her the chance to share that with me," Henry admitted, his voice low. "I pushed her so hard to follow my path that I didn't see the path she wanted to take. And when she tried to tell me, I didn't listen. Daniel's gaze softened, though his posture remained guarded. She didn't hate you, he said quietly. She was just scared to let you down. Henry felt a lump rise in his throat. That's my biggest regret, he said, that she felt like she couldn't be herself around me. The two sat in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation settling over them. Finally, Daniel spoke. She loved you, he said. Mom always said that. Even when things got hard, she still cared about you. Henry looked at him, his chest tightening with emotion. Thank you for telling me that, he said. Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful. I've been thinking about her a lot lately, he admitted. About what she'd think of all this us, the car, everything. Henry managed a small smile. I think she'd be happy, he said. She always wanted us to be close. The rest of the day passed in a steady rhythm of work, their shared effort on the Mustang bringing a quiet sense of connection. By the time they finished the brakes, the car was one step closer to being roadworthy. As Daniel packed up to leave, he paused at the garage door. Thanks for today, he said, his tone sincere. Thank you, Henry replied, for giving me the chance to get to know you. Daniel nodded, offering a small smile before heading to his car. Henry Carter woke up early the following Saturday, the chill of late autumn seeping through the windows of the estate. The previous week's conversation with Daniel lingered in his mind, stirring feelings of both sorrow and hope. He felt the weight of every missed opportunity with Lily, but the time spent with Daniel had started to ease that ache. After pouring himself a cup of coffee, Henry wandered into the garage. The Mustang stood in the center of the room, its frame gleaming under the overhead lights. They had come so far with the restoration, and Henry couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, not just in the car, but in the bond he and Daniel were slowly building. But Henry wanted to do more. He needed to show Daniel that this wasn't just about the car, that it wasn't just about making amends for the past. He wanted Daniel to know he was proud of him, not as a replacement for Lily, but as his own person. An idea began to form in his mind. That afternoon, Daniel arrived, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets to fight the chill. Morning, he said, his tone lighter than it had been in weeks. Morning, Henry replied with a smile. I thought we'd do something different today. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Different how? Henry gestured toward the Mustang. We've been working hard on this car, but I realized something, it needs a finishing touch. Something that makes it yours. Daniel frowned, confused. What do you mean? Henry stepped over to the workbench and picked up a small box. Inside was a custom engraved plaque that read, Restored by Daniel Reed and Henry Carter, 2024. I had this made for the dashboard, Henry said, handing the box to Daniel. This car wouldn't be where it is without you. I wanted to make sure your name was on it. Daniel stared at the plaque, his expression unreadable. You didn't have to do this, he said quietly. I wanted to, Henry replied. You put so much of yourself into this project. You deserve to be recognized for it. Daniel ran his fingers over the engraving, a small smile tugging at his lips. It's pretty cool, he admitted. Henry chuckled. I'll take that as a win. The two spent the afternoon installing the plaque and finishing the final touches on the Mustang's interior. As they worked, Daniel's mood seemed lighter, the usual wariness in his tone replaced with something closer to comfort. At one point, Daniel glanced at Henry. You know, I wasn't sure about this whole thing at first, he said, his voice hesitant. Working on the car, spending time here, I didn't think it'd mean much. And now? Henry asked, careful not to sound too eager. Daniel shrugged, but his expression softened. It's been good, better than I expected. Henry felt a swell of pride, but kept his response measured. I'm glad to hear that. It's meant a lot to me, too. By the time the day ended, the Mustang was nearly complete. Daniel leaned against the workbench, wiping his hands on a rag as he surveyed their progress. We're getting close, he said. I can't wait to see it on the road. Neither can I, Henry replied. We'll take it out for its first drive together once you're ready. Daniel nodded, his smile small but genuine. Deal. That evening, as Daniel packed up to leave, Henry decided to take another step forward. Daniel, he began, his tone hesitant, I've been thinking about how much progress we've made not just with the car but with us. And I wanted to say, I'm proud of you. For everything. Daniel froze for a moment, clearly caught off guard. Thanks, he said after a pause, his voice quieter than usual. Henry nodded, letting the moment linger before changing the subject. Same time next week? Yeah, Daniel said, his expression thoughtful as he stepped into his car. The Mustang gleamed in the soft light of the garage, its restoration nearly complete. The seats had been reupholstered, the engine meticulously tuned, and the final touches the custom plaque Daniel and Henry had installed the previous week made it feel like something more than a car. It was a testament to the bond they were slowly building, a bridge between two lives that had once felt worlds apart. On this particular Saturday, Henry decided to take a small risk. As he and Daniel worked to align the wheels, Henry glanced at him, his voice calm but deliberate. "Daniel, would you be open to visiting Lily's grave with me?" Daniel straightened, his hands still on the torque wrench. His expression was unreadable, his blue eyes clouded with thought. "Why?" he asked, his voice even. Henry hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I've been thinking a lot about her lately, about everything I missed, everything I didn't understand until it was too late. I thought it might be good for us to go together, to talk about her." Daniel's grip on the wrench tightened for a moment before he set it down. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think I'd like that." The drive to the cemetery was quiet. Daniel sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window as the scenery shifted from bustling city streets to the rolling hills of the countryside. Henry stole occasional glances at him, wondering what was going through his grandson's mind. When they arrived, the crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves. The path to Lily's grave was lined with towering oaks, their branches nearly bare. Henry carried a small bouquet of white lilies, her favorite. They reached the headstone, and for a moment, neither spoke. The polished granite bore Lily's name, along with a simple inscription, "Beloved daughter and mother, forever missed." Henry knelt and placed the flowers at the base of the grave, his movements slow and reverent. Daniel stood a few steps back, his arms crossed over his chest. "She always loved the fall," Henry said softly, breaking the silence. "She used to say it was the perfect season, beautiful, but fleeting." Daniel nodded, his gaze fixed on the headstone. "Mom used to talk about her like she was larger than life," he said. "She said Lily could light up a room just by walking in." "She could," Henry replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But I didn't always let her shine the way she wanted to. I was so focused on what I thought was best for her that I didn't see how much I was dimming her light." Daniel stepped closer, his posture still guarded. "Do you think she ever forgave you?" he asked, his voice quiet. Henry swallowed hard, the question cutting deep. "I don't know," he admitted. "I hope so. But even if she didn't, I can't blame her. I made mistakes I can never take back. All I can do now is try to honor her memory by being the man I wasn't when she was here." Daniel's expression softened, though his shoulders remained tense. "I used to blame you," he said after a long pause. "When I was younger, I thought, if he had just been different, maybe things would have been better. But as I got older, I realized it's not that simple. People are complicated. They are," Henry agreed, his heart heavy. "But that doesn't excuse the ways I failed her, or you." Daniel finally looked at him, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and understanding. "I don't think she hated you," he said. "I think she just wanted you to see her for who she was." Henry felt his chest tighten, the weight of Daniel's words settling over him like a heavy blanket. "I wish I had," he said. "More than anything." They stood in silence for a while, the cool breeze rustling the leaves around them. Henry watched as Daniel crouched beside the grave, his fingers brushing the edge of the headstone. "I don't remember her," Daniel said softly. "Not really, but I think about her all the time. What she was like, what she would have said to me if she were still here. She would have told you how proud she was of you," Henry said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "How much she loved you. I know that for certain." Daniel glanced up at him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thanks," he said quietly. As they walked back to the car, the tension between them felt lighter, the air easier to breathe. They didn't talk much on the drive back to the estate, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was reflective, a shared moment of connection forged through their mutual love for the woman who had brought them together. Later that evening, Henry sat alone in the garage, staring at the Mustang. The day's visit to Lily's grave had stirred something deep within him, a renewed determination to make the most of the time he still had. When Daniel had agreed to come to the cemetery, it felt like a small victory. But now, Henry realized it was much more than that. It was a sign that Daniel was beginning to trust him, to see him as someone who wanted to share in his life, not control it. He picked up a wrench from the workbench, turning it over in his hands. The Mustang still had a few finishing touches to complete, but Henry knew it was more than just a car now. It was a symbol of their progress, a reflection of the relationship they were rebuilding piece by piece. And as Henry thought about the road ahead, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The morning after their visit to Lily's grave, Henry Carter woke with a sense of clarity. The ache of regret hadn't left him. It probably never would, but the time he had spent with Daniel at the cemetery had given him something else: purpose. For years, Henry's life had revolved around building his empire, amassing wealth and power, and maintaining control. Now he saw the hollowness of it all. He wasn't looking for redemption anymore. He was looking for connection, and Daniel was the key to that. When Daniel arrived at the estate that Saturday, there was a subtle change in his demeanor. He greeted Henry with a nod and a faint smile, his usual guardedness giving way to something more open. "Morning," Daniel said, setting his backpack down near the workbench. "Good morning," Henry replied. "I was thinking we could finish up the wiring today. Once that's done, we'll be ready to test the engine." Daniel's eyes lit up with excitement. "Finally," he said, "I was starting to think we'd never get to this point." Henry chuckled. "Patience is a virtue, or so I've heard." Daniel smirked. "Not one of my strong suits." The two worked side by side for most of the morning, their movements synchronized after weeks of collaboration. Henry had always been meticulous in his work, but he was beginning to appreciate Daniel's natural instincts. The younger man had a knack for solving problems quickly, often coming up with creative solutions that Henry wouldn't have considered. "You ever think about going into engineering?" Henry asked as Daniel secured a connection under the dashboard. Daniel shrugged, not looking up. "I've thought about it. I like working with my hands, figuring out how things work. But college isn't exactly in the cards right now." Henry hesitated. "If you wanted to pursue it, I'd be happy to help. Not with money," he added quickly, "but with guidance, connections, whatever you need." Daniel paused, his hands stilling for a moment. "I don't know," he said finally. "It's a big commitment, and I'm not sure I'm ready for something like that." Henry nodded, choosing not to press further. "Well, if you ever change your mind, just know I'm here." By midday, they had finished the wiring. Daniel stepped back to admire their work, his expression a mix of pride and anticipation. "This might actually run," he said, his tone light but hopeful. Henry grinned. "It'll run, and when it does, we'll take it out for its first drive together." Daniel nodded, his smile growing. "Deal." After lunch, Daniel surprised Henry by bringing up a subject they hadn't discussed in detail before. "I've been thinking about Lily," Daniel said, leaning against the workbench. "What she would have wanted from me." Henry set down the rag he had been using to clean his hands, giving Daniel his full attention. "What do you think she would have wanted?" Daniel shrugged, his gaze distant. "She always wanted me to be happy. Mom used to say that all the time that Lily didn't care what I did, as long as I was happy doing it." Henry nodded, his throat tightening. "She would have wanted you to follow your own path. She always valued independence, even when we didn't see eye to eye about what that looked like." Daniel looked at him, his blue eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and sadness. "What do you think my path is?" Henry hesitated, careful not to impose his own expectations. "I think your path is whatever you make of it," he said finally. "But I see someone who's talented, hardworking, and capable of great things. Whatever you choose, I'll support you." Daniel studied him for a moment before nodding. "Thanks," he said quietly. The rest of the afternoon was spent preparing the Mustang for its first engine test. Henry could feel the excitement building between them, their shared anticipation palpable as they checked and double-checked every connection and system. By the time Daniel left that evening, the Mustang was ready. "Next week," Henry said as Daniel packed up his tools. "We'll fire it up." Daniel grinned, his enthusiasm breaking through his usual guardedness. "Can't wait." That night, Henry sat alone in the garage, staring at the Mustang. The car had been a symbol of unfinished dreams for so long, but now it represented something much more significant. the relationship he was building with Daniel, one piece at a time. For the first time in years, Henry felt like he was creating something meaningful, and as he thought about the road ahead, he felt a sense of peace, knowing that the best parts of his life were still to come. The following Saturday was crisp and cool, the early winter air carrying a bite that hinted at the season ahead. Henry Carter stood in the garage, his breath fogging slightly as he double-checked the final connections on the Mustang. The engine was ready for its first test, a milestone in the car's restoration, and perhaps more importantly, in his relationship with Daniel. When Daniel arrived, his usual casual demeanor was replaced with something more animated. He strode into the garage, a mix of anticipation and excitement lighting up his face. "Today's the day," Daniel said, rubbing his hands together. "It is," Henry replied, smiling. "Let's see if all our hard work pays off." The two worked methodically, ensuring everything was in place before attempting to start the engine. The Mustang's gleaming body reflected the overhead lights, a testament to the hours they had poured into its revival. "Fuel line's good," Daniel said, crouching beside the car. "Batteries charged. You ready to fire it up?" "Let's do it," Henry said, moving to the driver's seat. As he turned the key, the engine sputtered once, then roared to life. The sound filled the garage, loud and powerful, a triumphant culmination of their efforts. Daniel let out a whoop, a grin spreading across his face. "It works," Henry laughed, his chest swelling with pride. "It does, and it sounds beautiful." The two shared a moment of quiet satisfaction, the hum of the engine a backdrop to their accomplishment. After the excitement subsided, they took a break, sitting on a pair of stools near the workbench. Daniel, still grinning, glanced at Henry. "You know, when we started this, I didn't think we'd actually finish it," Daniel admitted. Henry chuckled. "Neither did I. But here we are." Daniel nodded, his expression turning thoughtful. "It's not just about the car, though, is it?" Henry looked at him, his smile fading slightly. "No, it's not. This car has been a way for us to connect, to build something together. But it's always been about more than that. It's about us." Daniel was silent for a moment before speaking. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately. About family, about Lily, about everything we've missed." Henry swallowed, his throat tight. "I have too," he said. "And I regret all of it, everything I missed, everything I didn't know. But being here with you, working on this car, has given me hope that we can still build something meaningful." Daniel's gaze softened, the usual guardedness in his expression replaced with a quiet understanding. "You've changed," he said simply. Henry smiled faintly. "I've had to. Losing Lily, it made me realize how much I was holding on to the wrong things. And meeting you showed me that it's not too late to get it right." As they finished their break, Daniel pulled out a small, worn notebook from his backpack. "What's that?" Henry asked, nodding toward it. "It's something Mom kept," Daniel said, flipping through the pages. "Letters Lily wrote to herself. She never sent them, but Mom found them after she passed." Henry felt a pang in his chest. "Letters?" Daniel nodded, finding the page he was looking for. "This one's about you," he said, holding it out. Henry hesitated before taking the notebook. His hands trembled slightly as he read the words scrawled in Lily's familiar handwriting. "Dear Dad, I don't know how to say this to you, so I'm writing it here. I wish you could see me for who I really am. I'm not perfect, and I never will be, but I want to make you proud in my own way. I hope someday you'll understand that." Henry closed the notebook, his eyes stinging. "I wish I could have told her that she didn't have to be perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I wish I'd known." Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder, a rare gesture of comfort. "She knew you loved her," he said. "Even if you didn't say it the way she needed to hear it, she knew." Henry looked at him, gratitude and sorrow mixing in his gaze. "Thank you," he said softly. As the afternoon wore on, the two prepared the Mustang for its first test drive. They adjusted the mirrors, checked the tire pressure, and made sure everything was ready for the road. "You want to take the first drive?" Henry asked, holding the keys out to Daniel. Daniel shook his head, a small smile on his face. "You go ahead. This was Lily's project first. It feels right for you to take the wheel." Henry nodded, his chest tightening with emotion. He climbed into the driver's seat, Daniel settling into the passenger side. As Henry guided the car down the driveway and onto the open road, the rumble of the engine beneath them He felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. The Mustang wasn't just a car, it was a bridge. A way to connect with Daniel, to honor Lily's memory, and to move forward together. By the time they returned to the garage, the sun was beginning to set, casting the room in a warm, golden light. "That was incredible," Daniel said, stepping out of the car. "It was," Henry agreed, his smile genuine. "Thank you for helping me finish this, for helping me find something I thought I'd lost." Daniel looked at him, his expression earnest. "You're not the only one who's found something." The Mustang had roared to life, and with it, a new chapter had begun for Henry and Daniel. The triumph of their first drive lingered in the air, a shared accomplishment that spoke volumes about how far they had come. But the road ahead wasn't just about the car, it was about continuing to repair the wounds of the past and forging a future that felt real and whole. The next weekend, Daniel arrived with an idea. "You've always been the one coming up with projects," he said as they stood in the garage, the Mustang gleaming behind them. "But I was thinking, maybe it's time I picked one." Henry raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you have in mind?" Daniel gestured toward the driveway. "I've got this old truck Mom's been holding onto for years. It's falling apart, but I think we can fix it together." Later that afternoon, Emma arrived in her worn pickup truck. It sputtered as she pulled into the driveway, the engine groaning with every turn of the wheels. Henry greeted her warmly, noticing the mix of hesitation and curiosity in her expression. "This is it?" he asked, nodding toward the truck. "Yep," Emma said, stepping out. "It's been in the family for years. My dad bought it when I was a kid, and I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it after he passed. But it's seen better days." The truck was a relic of faded blue Ford with chipped paint, rust along the edges, and a sagging suspension. But beneath its worn exterior, Henry saw potential. "I think we can bring it back to life," he said, glancing at Daniel. Daniel grinned. "That's the plan." For the next few weeks, the truck became their focus. It was a different kind of project, less about perfection and more about preserving the memories tied to it. Daniel was more hands-on this time, taking the lead in diagnosing issues and deciding on repairs. "This was my grandpa's truck," Daniel said one afternoon as they replaced the fuel pump. "He used to drive me to school in it when I was little. Mom said he loved this thing more than anything." Henry listened intently, sensing how much the truck meant to Daniel. "It's a good truck," he said, "and it's lucky to have someone like you to take care of it." Daniel shrugged, but the pride in his expression was unmistakable. As they worked, Emma began stopping by more often, bringing sandwiches or coffee and watching from the sidelines as Henry and Daniel labored over the truck. "I'll admit," she said one day as they took a break, "I didn't think this whole thing would last. You and Daniel working together. I mean," Henry chuckled, "neither did I. But he surprised me in the best ways." Emma nodded, her gaze softening as she watched Daniel tinker with the engine. "He's always been like that. Quiet but determined. He doesn't give up easily." "He gets that from you," Henry said. Emma blinked, caught off guard by the compliment. "Maybe," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. As the weeks turned into months, the truck began to transform. They replaced the rusted panels, installed new shocks, and sanded down the chipped paint in preparation for a fresh coat. Henry found himself growing closer to Daniel in ways he hadn't thought possible. Their conversations became more personal, more open, as they worked side by side. One afternoon, as they worked on the truck's interior, Daniel brought up a topic that caught Henry by surprise. "I've been thinking about what you said," Daniel began, his voice casual but steady. "About college." Henry paused. Looking up from the seat, he was reupholstering. "Oh, I'm not saying I'm ready to jump into it," Daniel said quickly. "But I've been looking into some programs. Automotive engineering, mostly, just to see what's out there." Henry felt a surge of pride, but kept his response measured. "That's great, Daniel. And if there's anything I can do to help advice, introductions, just let me know." Daniel nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "Thanks. I'll let you know." The day the truck was finally roadworthy, they celebrated with a test drive. Emma joined them, sitting in the passenger seat as Daniel took the wheel and Henry sat in the back. The engine hummed smoothly, the truck rolling down the driveway and onto the open road. Daniel grinned as he drove, the wind tugging at his hair. "This feels good," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. It should, Henry replied. You've earned it. Emma glanced back at Henry, her expression soft. Thank you, she said quietly. Henry shook his head. No, thank you for trusting me with him. That evening, as they parked the truck back in the garage, Daniel turned to Henry. You know, he said, his tone thoughtful, when we first started working on the Mustang, I wasn't sure if this was going to work. Us? I mean, Henry smiled. And now? Daniel nodded toward the truck, his expression calm but sincere. Now I think we got a good thing going. Henry felt a swell of emotion, his chest tightening with gratitude. I think so too, he said softly. Winter arrived at the Carter estate with a crisp stillness, blanketing the rolling hills in frost. The Mustang now rested proudly in the garage, its restoration complete, while the truck project brought a new sense of excitement and purpose to Daniel and Henry's weekends. But as the holidays approached, Henry began to feel the weight of a new question. How could he strengthen the fragile bond they had built? The Mustang had brought them together, and the truck kept them connected, but Henry knew that their relationship needed more than shared projects to truly last. One Saturday morning, as they worked to align the truck's front axle, Henry broached the subject. Daniel, he began, wiping grease from his hands, I was thinking, the holidays are coming up. How would you feel about spending Christmas here? With me? Daniel glanced up from his work, surprise flickering across his face. Christmas? Here? Henry nodded, his tone cautious. I thought it might be nice. We could have dinner, maybe invite your mom. Keep it simple. Daniel hesitated, his expression unreadable. I'll have to ask Mom, he said finally. We usually do Christmas at home. Of course, Henry said quickly, not wanting to push. Think about it. No pressure. The following week, Emma called. Daniel mentioned your Christmas idea, she said, her tone even. He wants to do it, but I wanted to make sure this isn't going to be too much. Henry sighed, leaning back in his chair. I don't want to overwhelm anyone, Emma. I just thought it might be nice for us to spend the day together. No big gestures, no expectations. Emma was quiet for a moment before replying. All right, but don't make it fancy, Henry. Daniel doesn't do fancy. Henry chuckled. Understood. When Christmas Eve arrived, Henry kept his promise. He prepared a simple meal, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans, and decorated the dining room with understated elegance. The tree in the corner was trimmed with white lights and a few tasteful ornaments, a subtle nod to the holiday without overwhelming the space. When Emma and Daniel arrived, Henry greeted them warmly. Daniel carried a small gift bag, his expression slightly sheepish. Figured I should bring something, Daniel said, holding out the bag. Henry smiled, taking the bag. You didn't have to, but thank you. Inside was a simple but thoughtful gift. A set of high-quality screwdrivers, each engraved with Henry's initials. They're for the garage, Daniel said quickly. Figured you could use an upgrade. Henry chuckled, touched by the gesture. They're perfect. Thank you. Dinner was relaxed and filled with conversation. Emma shared stories from her childhood, many of which revolved around the truck they were now restoring. Daniel chimed in with memories of his own, and Henry found himself laughing more than he had in years. After dinner, they gathered in the living room. Henry handed Daniel a small box, wrapped neatly in gold paper. What's this? Daniel asked, his brow furrowing as he took the box. Just a little something, Henry said, his tone casual. Daniel unwrapped the box to reveal a vintage pocket watch, its silver surface polished to a shine. He opened it to find an inscription, "For Daniel, keep moving forward." Daniel stared at the watch for a long moment, his expression unreadable. It belonged to my father, Henry explained. He gave it to me when I started my business. I thought it might be time to pass it on. Daniel nodded slowly, his voice quiet. Thanks, he said. This means a lot. The first weeks of the new year brought a sense of renewal to Henry Carter. The holidays with Daniel and Emma had left him hopeful for the future, and their regular work on the truck continued to strengthen the bond they were building. But with the truck nearing completion, Henry felt an urgency to solidify the progress they had made something lasting, something meaningful. One Saturday morning, as they installed the truck's freshly painted tailgate, Daniel looked up from his work. So, what's next? He asked, his tone casual but curious. Henry tilted his head. Next, After the truck, Daniel clarified. What are we going to work on? The question caught Henry off guard. For months, their projects had been the backbone of their relationship, but he hadn't considered what would come after. I hadn't thought about it, Henry admitted. But I suppose we'll have to find something else to tackle. Daniel smirked. Better start looking. Can't have you getting bored. Henry chuckled, appreciating the subtle shift in Daniel's tone. What had started as guarded and distant now carried a hint of warmth, even humor. As they wrapped up their work for the day, Henry decided it was time to share an idea he had been contemplating for weeks. Daniel, he began, leaning against the truck bed, I've been thinking about something. A way for us to work together, not just on cars, but on something bigger. Daniel raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Henry took a deep breath. I've spent my life building a business, accumulating wealth, and creating an empire. But it's always felt hollow. Working with you has reminded me of what really matters. Creating something that lasts, something that helps people. I want to start a scholarship fund for people like you. Daniel blinked, clearly taken aback. A scholarship funds? For students who want to pursue careers in automotive engineering, mechanics, or any field where they can work with their hands, Henry explained. People with talent and drive, but without the resources to chase their dreams. We could call it the Lily Carter Memorial Fund. Daniel's expression softened at the mention of his mother's name. That's a good idea, he said slowly. I want you to be part of it, Henry added. Not just a name, but in shaping it, deciding how it works, who it helps. This could be our project, not just mine. Daniel was quiet for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. You really want me to help with this? Absolutely, Henry said. You understand the challenges better than I ever could. Your perspective would make all the difference. Daniel nodded, his lips curving into a small smile. All right, let's do it. In the weeks that followed, the two began laying the groundwork for the scholarship fund. They brainstormed ideas, reached out to local schools and organizations, and even visited a few trade schools to gain insight into what students needed most. For Henry, the process was transformative. It wasn't just about giving back, it was about working side by side with Daniel, seeing the younger man's passion and intelligence shine in new ways. For Daniel, it was a chance to channel his experiences into something meaningful, a way to honor his mother's memory while helping others. One crisp spring afternoon, the truck was finally complete. Its glossy blue finish gleamed in the sunlight, and its engine purred as smoothly as the day it left the factory. Daniel and Henry took it for a drive, the open road stretching before them. As they cruised down the highway, Daniel glanced at Henry. You know, Daniel said, his tone light, this is the first time I felt like we're really a team. Henry smiled, his hands steady on the wheel. We are, and I'm proud of what we've built, this truck, the Mustang, the scholarship fund, all of it. Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful. Mom would have liked this, he said quietly. Seeing us work together, doing something good. Henry's chest tightened, but he managed to keep his voice steady. I think so too. When they returned to the estate, Emma was waiting for them in the driveway. She smiled as she saw the truck, her eyes shining with pride. It looks perfect, she said as they climbed out. Thanks to your son, Henry replied, clapping Daniel on the shoulder. Daniel rolled his eyes, but grinned. And a little help from you. That evening, as they gathered on the porch, the sun setting behind the hills, Henry felt a deep sense of contentment. For years, his life had been defined by ambition and regret. But now, it was filled with purpose, love, and a sense of connection he had never thought possible. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, Henry glanced at Daniel and Emma, his family. We've come a long way, he said softly. Daniel nodded. And we've still got a long way to go. Henry smiled, his heart full. I wouldn't have it any other way. That night, as he sat alone in his study, Henry opened the notebook Daniel had shared with him months ago. He reread Lily's words, her hopes and fears etched into the pages, and felt a renewed sense of responsibility not just to her memory, but to the family they had built together. The legacy he was leaving wasn't one of wealth or power. It was one of love, resilience, and second chances. And for Henry Carter, that was enough. As Henry Carter closed the notebook and gazed out at the quiet night, he felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of belonging, a feeling that his life finally had meaning beyond the walls of his estate. For the first time, he wasn't chasing after wealth or legacy. He had found something far more valuable: family and the chance to make a difference. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about redemption, second chances, and the power of human connection. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below about what you think of Henry and Daniel's journey. And don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Together, we can keep sharing stories that inspire, uplift, and remind us of what truly matters. Thank you for being part of this journey.